Hello and welcome to this episode of Climate Watch. I'm Zhou Fang. Since January 1st, the European Union's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, has taken full effect. As a cornerstone of the EU's Fit for 55 climate ambition, the CBAM places a carbon price on imports, including iron, steel, and aluminum. However, for manufacturers in China and beyond, this mechanism introduces a complex new reality. It's no longer just about the quality or price of a product. It's now fundamentally about the carbon embedded within it. The immediate challenge is one of data and compliance. How do companies build the systems to measure, report, and verify emissions to EU standards? What happens when enterprises are faced with potentially high default values set by the EU? What about the costs that these companies exporting to the EU markets have to bear? In this episode, we spoke with an industry insider and a scholar to unpack the CBAM's operational mechanics, its impacts on Chinese exporters and global trade, and some of the possible methods to navigate the policy tool. First, I spoke with Tu Jianjun, Managing Director of Agora Energy China. Mr. Tu, welcome to our show. We know the EU's CBAM, or the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, has fully taken effect since January 1st this year, and currently we know it covers several sectors, including iron and steel, aluminum and cement, etc. First, could you briefly introduce what the EU's CBAM is and how it works?
Thank you very much, Ms. Zhou, for having me. CBAM is part of the EU's broad Fit for 50 climate package, which aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030. Its core purpose is to prevent carbon leakage, as free allowance under the EU emissions trading system are gradually phased out, and to ensure that imported products face a carbon cost comparable to that borne by EU producers. In practical terms, CBAM places responsibility on EU importers. They must report the quantity of imported goods and the carbon emissions embedded in those products. Once the financial phase is fully implemented, importers will need to purchase and surrender CBAM certificates priced in line with EU carbon prices. If verified emissions data from producers are unavailable, higher default value apply, increasing costs. In effect, CBAM extends the EU's carbon pricing system beyond its border to imports.
You mentioned the high default figures and costs, and I think this all have to do with Chinese enterprises. I mean, with this mechanism in place, how will Chinese enterprises be affected? Could you possibly give us a specific example?
So CBAM, of course, affects Chinese enterprise exporting to the EU in a direct but layered way. First, there is an additional carbon-related cost linked to the product's emission intensity and the gap between the EU and Chinese carbon prices. Second, there are indirect but significant compliance costs tied to emissions accounting, data management, and verification. A clear example in the steel sector, a Chinese steel producer using a traditional blast furnace faces CBAM costs determined by both its carbon intensity and the EU-China carbon price difference. If the producer cannot provide emissions data verified in accordance with EU standards, EU importers must apply higher default values, which can significantly increase the final cost.
It sounds like that Chinese enterprises exporting to EU markets will definitely get affected. And then what prominent difficulties and challenges will these enterprises that want to export to EU markets face during the process? Aside from the costs you mentioned, such as verifying the data produced during the process, are there any other costs incurred? For instance, do Chinese enterprises need to resort to some consulting services?
This is indeed a very important question for EU CBAM related policy discussions. For Chinese exporters, CBAM effectively turns carbon performance and carbon data into conditions of access to the EU market. One major challenge is building monitoring, reporting, and verification systems that meet EU methodological and audit requirements. This often requires new internal process and external verification. There are also commercial challenges. Exporters may need to renegotiate contracts to address emissions disclosure, cost sharing, and liability for reporting errors. Operationally, companies with higher emissions may need to invest in energy efficiency, cleaner power, or process upgrades beyond the carbon price itself. Firms face additional costs from IT systems, staff training, verification fees, consulting service, and ongoing compliance management. Indeed, CBAM is expected to bring certain challenges for exporters, but meanwhile, it also offers opportunities for exporters to further improve its climate mitigation practice.
In the process, I don't think Chinese enterprises are alone in meeting the requirements. There are also the Chinese government, different departments, institutions, and maybe enterprises of different sectors. So what do you think these different parties can do to work together to form synergies to maybe, on the one hand, to help reduce the costs for these enterprises, and on the other hand, maybe possibly to form synergies to work together to gain more say in international rulemaking?
I fully agree with you. Key stakeholders in China should work together to create synergy in order to cope with EU CBAM related challenges. For instance, public institutions can lower compliance costs by providing shared infrastructure. This includes standardized sectorial methodologies, authoritative emissions factor databases, and digital reporting tools aligned with international practice. They can also strengthen domestic verification capacity through training, accreditation, and quality control, reducing reliance on expensive external services. More broadly, policies that expand clean power supply, improve industry efficiency, and support low-carbon technologies help reduce product carbon intensity at the source. So this is some of the examples how key stakeholders could work together to create synergy.
But let's talk about it from another perspective, which is trade. The CBAM imposes a carbon price differential on imported products, requiring foreign products to bear carbon costs similar to those within the EU. It's viewed as a green barrier with trade protectionist undertones. So, what is your view on such barriers?
CBAM sits exactly at the intersection of climate policy and trade policy. From a climate perspective, CBAM aims to prevent carbon leakage and reward investment in cleaner production, which can benefit no carbon producers globally. At the same time, it changes competitiveness and imposes administrative burdens, which is why it is sometimes viewed by some countries, some stakeholders as a trade barrier. Whether it is seen as legitimate depends largely on implementation, particularly transparencies, non-discrimination, and whether it is accompanied by constructive international dialogue rather than unilateral escalation. These effects are very important to determine whether, in the end, CBAM is a legitimate climate policy rather than a green barrier.
Let's come to one of the controversies surrounding the CBAM. Well, it requires developing countries to bear carbon costs of the same intensity as the EU. But we know historically cumulative carbon emissions from developed countries have been dominant. What overall impact will the CBAM have on other developing countries? And what future implications will it have for global climate governance?
This is a very good question. For many developing countries, CBAM creates a dual challenge. Exporters must build the capacity to generate CBAM-compliant emissions data while also finding capital to reduce emissions in trade-exposed sectors. Although CBAM may accelerate global industry decarbonization, it also raises equity concerns, given historical emissions responsibility and uneven capacity between advanced economy and developing country bloc. This highlights the need for complementary measures, including capacity building, technology cooperation, and climate finance, to ensure that both measures by EU and maybe other advanced economy could also support inclusive and cooperative global climate governance in the years to come.
I also spoke with Boqiang, Dean of China Institute for Studies in Energy Policy. We continued our discussions on topics including what measures affected enterprises can take, and the European Commission's proposal of expanding the CBAM scope. Let's take a listen. Talking about the default carbon emission intensity figures set by the European Union side, actually, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce also says the EU side set significantly high default carbon emission intensity figures for Chinese products, and it plans to increase them annually over the next 3 years, and this obviously does not align with China's current actual levels or future development trends, and also constitutes unfair and discriminatory treatment towards China. So how would you interpret this statement, and what view of international governance does it reflect?
I think the statement is quite clear because it's really violated the basic principle of Paris Agreement, common but differentiated responsibilities. You guys emit a lot historically. The standard itself is totally indifferent from the common but differentiated responsibilities. The reason I'm arguing this is that, look, your structure, industrial structure, and any structure is quite different from developing countries. Yet you try to set the same level, which is default value, okay, same level of whatever you can do there. It doesn't make sense, okay? So the point here is that, but in fact, the biggest impact is not only on China, it's on the developing countries. There's some estimate that the border tax will reduce Africa's overall GDP by almost 1%, and that's quite substantial. In other words, this looks like the legitimate common climate policy, but it has been criticized by many countries, particularly developing countries. It become a green trade protectionism.
Indeed, the CBAM causes difficulty for Chinese enterprises. So, what measures can affected enterprises take to meet the CBAM's requirements if they really want to export or keep exporting to EU markets in order to overcome obstacles and reduce losses?
So I think the fundamental is that we need to promote technology upgrade. If we really want to export to European Union, to have a production structure which is very similar to European one, then your emissions it will be aligned with each other. I think with the Chinese efficiency that's achievable. Another one, of course, is that our energy structure, because we are much more high carbon intensive compared to European Union. And that's what we're working on. We try to promote the renewables, the clean energy, to substitute the coal. Eventually, our energy structure is much lower. And therefore, whatever the default value European Union set towards China will be lower. That's basically what we do. But there's other things we can do is that mutual recognition. For example, that we can actively follow the process to recognize, to have a mechanism that the Chinese and European market, how to mutually connect to each other. If mutual recognition is achieved in the future, then everything will become much easier. But at this moment, I think that we start with, it is best that to start to looking for protection process.
A big thank you to Professor Lin Boqiang, Dean of China Institute for Studies in Energy Policy, and Tu Jianjun, Managing Director of Agora Energy China. And thank you for listening to this episode of Climate Watch. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to share it with your friends. Bye for now.